Merhabalar. Bizans mühürleri Güncel Araştırmalar Çalıştayı'nda son gündeyiz. Bugün Pantelis Charalambakis'i dinleyeceğiz. Nilgün Hocam buyurun, Pantelis'i ve sunumunu taklit etmek için sözü size bırakıyorum.
Teşekkür ederim. Tekrar merhaba arkadaşlar. Günaydın herkese. Bugünkü programdaki son konuşmacımız Doktor Pantelis Charalambakis. Kendisi Olga'nın da bahsettiği gibi Taktikon Araştırma Projesi ekibindendir. Bulgaristan Sofya'dan katılıyor şu anda. Şu anda bir müzesi de olan Bulgaristan Bilimler Akademisi, Ulusal Arkeoloji Enstitüsü, Numizmatik ve Epigrafi Departmanı'nda araştırmacı olarak aktif görevlidir. Doktor Charalambakis, Ioannina Yanya Üniversitesi Tarih ve Arkeoloji Bölümü, çok affedersiniz kendi kendine attı dosya. Yanya Üniversitesi Tarih ve Arkeoloji Bölümü, Tarih Bölümü mezunudur. Doktora tezi Problems of Historical Geography of the Pontus Exinus, Pontus Exinus bölgesinin tarihsel problemleri üzerine M.Ö. 1. yüzyıl, M.Ö. 6. yüzyıl arası dönemde Kırım üzerinedir. Sorbonne Üniversitesi'nde Bizans epigrafisi ve paleografyası üzerine seminerlere katılmıştır. Kendisi aynı zamanda lisanslı turizm rehberidir. İlgi alanları Bizans sigillografisi, prosopografisi, Bizans tarihi, Balkanların Orta Çağ tarihi, Antik ve Orta Çağ dönemlerinde Kırım tarihi ve topografyası, Antik ve Orta Çağ dönemlerinde Doğu Avrupa coğrafyası ve kartografyası, toponimi ve antroponimi ve kendisi de bir Giritli olduğu için Orta Çağ'da Girit tarihidir. International Hellenic University School of Humanities'de Karadeniz Çalışmaları adlı yüksek lisans programında dersler vermiştir. 2019 yılından beri Bulgaristan'daki Manastirsko, Orlovo, Mirovyane, Gornji Dabnik gibi pek çok yerde kurtarma kazılarına katılmaktadır. Kendisi Olga Karayorgu ve Christos Malatras'la birlikte birçok özel koleksiyon ve müze koleksiyonlarındaki tematik mühürleri, yani temalarla ilgili mühürleri yerinde incelemiştir. Ayrıca Bükreş'te Romanya Akademisi Kütüphanesi'nde bulunan Numizmatik Departmanı'ndaki koleksiyonu, Bulgaristan Şumen'deki Bölgesel Tarih Müzesi, St. Petersburg'daki Hermitage Müzesi, Moskova Devlet Tarih Müzesi, Paris'teki Bibliothèque Nationale de France ile Institut Français des Études Byzantines koleksiyonlarını, Münih'teki Staatliche Münzsammlung ile Bibliothèque Royale de Belgique, Belçika Kraliyet Kütüphanesi koleksiyonlarındaki koleksiyonlar üzerinde araştırmalar yapmıştır. Birçok makale ve uluslararası bildirinin yazarıdır. Şimdi sözü kendisine bırakmak istiyorum. Microphone is yours, Dr. Charalambakis. Oriste parakalo.
Thank you very much, Nilgün. Hello again, and thank you all for being here. Those of you who were watching us the previous days, and as well as any new participants. Today's lecture, Non-Religious Images and Motifs on Byzantine Seals, is very different from the first one about the professions. I'm going to present to you in brief some non-religious images and motifs on Byzantine seals. Byzantine culture and art are associated with Christian religion and Christian religious motifs. However, during the 1,000 years of late Roman and Byzantine history, people felt the need to use other symbols too, not necessarily related to any religion, or they used old religious symbols that had by that time lost their original meaning. In order to show you the non-religious motifs, you must first understand how the religious ones look like. And then I will proceed with a series of quite interesting and unusual scenes, and I shall finish with a few comments on the theoretical aspect of the topic. First, about iconography and motifs. In late antiquity or early Byzantium, the Byzantine seals were but a continuation of the Roman seals. A striking difference is to be found in the process of making the seals, because the Romans were using a one-sided, usually conical object, while the Byzantines later introduced a two-sided flat disc. As for the iconography, though, the early Byzantine seals are quite similar to the Roman ones. Apart from the portraits of the emperors and empresses, people used to show various animals and also portraits of lesser people, that is, members of the state mechanism or the nobility, but still not directly related to the imperial family. Depiction of religious scenes was very common on coins, but less frequent on seals. One of the most popular images, balancing between religion and political propaganda, was the figure of Victoria, or Nike in Greek, which was usually accompanying the emperor's portrait. As expected, the spread of Christianity within the empire brought new customs and fashions and introduced a whole new series of images in art, and inevitably on both coins and seals. Nevertheless, this change did not occur from one day to another, but it was a very long process. Towards the end of the 5th century, the religious Christian elements made their appearance on seals, albeit rarely used. Their presence is stronger from the mid-6th century, although it took another 100 years or so until they prevailed over the other patterns. In fact, the predominant to that date patterns, that is the monograms, the human figures or deities, the letters and the animals and birds, were the most favorite decorative motifs on seals until the 3rd quarter of the 7th century. Now, let's see a few specimens among the earliest late Roman Byzantine seals bearing Christian elements, dated in the 5th and in the late 5th or perhaps early 6th century. The first one, issued by Constantinus Basilicus, shows the portrait of St. John the Baptist. The second, issued by Isidoros, shows the Virgin, the Mother of God, holding Christ between two cypress trees. The third seal on the left shows on the obverse the Virgin, and the other shows on the obverse a bearded saint, and on the reverse a monogram with the owner's name, Theon. Notice that the second and the third seal have a cross at the beginning of the inscription, while the first one doesn't. The last one does not have a cross either. Why there are such differences among seals with Christian elements? It is because this period, from the late 5th until the 3rd quarter of the 7th century, is a transitional period regarding the appearance of religious, that is Christian, elements on late Roman Byzantine seals. The owners of such seals have of course adopted several Christian motifs, but there is no general norm as yet, no established patterns or rules about how a seal with Christian motifs should look like. In other words, there is a new trend, but still no established fashion. The main Christian iconographic motifs on Byzantine seals were the cruciform invocative monogram, which you see on the upper left, the cross, upper right, the portraits of holy figures, such as the Virgin with Christ, which you see here down left, and the Dormition of the Virgin, just to show you a few examples. It must be noted, though, that the Christian motifs were not the only only religious motifs in Byzantium. Here you see a Byzantine seal with Arabic inscription. Although Islamic art in general was forbidding the representation of human figures, there were several exceptions depicted on Seljuk coins, for example, showing portraits of people or even the so-called Lament of Saladin. Also, there are lead seals, and these are not double strike, of which the one side shows a Christian figure with inscription in Greek, and the other has inscription in Arabic. And on the right here, you see a Byzantine seal with a Jewish name written in Greek and a menorah. And now we may proceed to the topic, which is non-religious images and motifs. I shall start with the floral decoration by showing you the Christian aspect and some typical patterns of crosses flanked by fleurons, from the simplest to the most elaborate and ornamented. You see how the floral decoration around the crosses is developing over the decades. Here they become more elaborate. In these two last images, you see how the floral decoration has expanded so much that they decided to merge it with the crosses. When there is no cross involved, though, we see something like this, which is either the so-called fleur de lis or a lotus flower. The same in the next photo. Although there is an invocative inscription beginning with the symbol of the cross, the flower itself may have no particular religious symbolism. Of course, the fleur-de-lis has been associated with the Holy Trinity, but it was also a symbol used in art since antiquity. As for the lotus, it is used extensively in Asian art for millennia. Then we see a palm tree, and it is the whole tree, not simply branches. And this is a very rare depiction of a tree, which, just like the fleur-de-lis, the lily, which I mentioned before, is usually shown within the context of a narrative scene. But when we see them isolated and not accompanied by a cross or another Christian symbol, it is not clear whether they bear the Christian symbolism or they are simply decorative motifs. Then we see a tree with many branches. There is no other information. And next, two cypress trees. Now here again, the cypress trees are depicted alone, while on other seals, like this one, for example, or one that Olga, if I remember well, showed us a couple of days ago, they flank inscriptions or figures. Although the cypress is also claimed by Christian religion, it is a common symbol used since the antiquity, especially in Armenian art and coinage, as well as in Roman art and coinage. And now I would like to make a comment which is not in the text, and I would ask one of the hosts to translate this.
Sure.
The seal which you see up above has been described in the Dumbarton Oaks online catalog of seals as a seal showing a crab. I followed the description and I only saw the miniature of the seal.
You mean crab, the animal, the sea animal?
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. However, yesterday, when I magnified a lot the image for my presentation to see it, I realized that it's just a rotated image of a cross. There is no crab. It is a mistake. I simply copied the information from Dumbarton Oaks website, but now that I zoomed in, I noticed that it's a cross. There is no crab.
So your presentation to Bizantolog members has initiated a discovery, a new discovery, a correction, let's say. Peki ben hemen bunu eklemek istiyorum. Sizlerle paylaştığımız sunum konuşmacımızın notları arasında yer almayan bir konu. Bu üst tarafta gördüğünüz mühürde ki imajın bir yengeç olduğu yazıyor Dumbarton Oaks'un mühür kataloğunda. Ancak dün bu sunumu hazırlamak için Doktor Charalambakis çalışırken ve bu imajı iyice büyüttüğünde fark etmiş ki bu aslında bir yengeç değil. Tam hiç beklenmeyecek bir şekilde aslında bir ters dönmüş bir haç olduğu sonucuna varmış. Yaptığı çalışmada, yaptığı incelemede. Ben de yorumunu yaptım. Bizim bu çalıştayımız aslında bir anlamda bir bilimsel bir düzeltmeye de mi acaba sebep olacak diye notunu çevirmiş oldum. Devam ediyor kendisi. Yes, I've just translated it. You can just go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And well, we skip this image and we go to the next one below, which has the symbol has been interpreted as a crab, but it is very likely that it's a turtle. I will show you another turtle later. And both symbols, crab and turtle, if it was a crab, are used since the antiquity. Then there are the peacocks in several representations. The peacock bird, apart from a Christian symbol, is also depicted in art since the very antique times, and it was associated with various religions. For example, it was related to the ancient Greek goddess Hera. Here we see, I will show you different types of peacocks on Byzantine seals. Some of them are in profile, some of them en face. It was also widely depicted in Asian art, and I shall return to this issue later. And here you see another bird. And then two birds carrying something which might be a lantern or even a small bell. There are several seals with depictions of birds carrying this object, although it is not clear what exactly it is or why it is carried by different types of birds. According to a scholar, Valery Stepanenko, these images are of Iranian Sassanid origin and influence, and he related the mysterious object with diadems shown on scenes with birds from the Sassanid era. Next, we see again two birds, possibly ducks, one of which is carrying the same mysterious object. They come from different centuries, the 9th and the 10th. It may be a coincidence, but we noticed that both officials who issued these seals were working with clothing. Does this mean that their professions, one is state-employed and one is self-employed, had something to do with birds, perhaps with the feathers used in clothes? This is only a suggestion. Here we see a representation of an eagle, this particular type being very typical and common in the early Byzantine period. In fact, most of the seals of that period showing eagles are of this type. In the next slide, there is a very different scene, an interesting composition with an eagle above attacking a turtle, which is biting a snake. So we see the eagle, the turtle, and the snake. Sometimes the animals are depicted on both sides of the seal, and there is neither inscription nor Christian or other religious symbols. Here we see eagles on one side and hares or rabbits on the other. The hare or rabbit is also depicted alone, this time within a star, which is inspired by similar drawings from late antiquity. We have exact stars like this, manuscripts from late antiquity. Now, this photo is taken from a book, and we don't know where the seal is kept today, perhaps in Paris. According to the editor, it shows a deer or stag, but it's not very clear. In the next image, the scene is much more clear. Here there is a lion catching a deer. And we shall continue with the carnivorous animals and the panther, or panther it is described on the Dumbarton Oaks website, or it's perhaps a lioness. And here is an early depiction of a male lion. Well, in the next slide, in this 10th century seal, the figure has more details. It's very interesting that even a monk decided to decorate his seal with a lion. Again, as I mentioned before, in all these cases, the animals are not accompanied by a religious Christian scene. For example, we don't see Daniel in the lion's den, but just a single lion, which does not necessarily imply any connection to religious symbolism. Also, in previous images, sometimes animals are shown on both sides of the disc. And here we see on the same seal, the lion, the male animal, and the lioness, the female. In the next, there is a lion and an eagle. And then a lion and a peacock. These seals bear no inscription or cross or any other symbol. The next shows a very peculiar combination of a wolf on the left and a bird above, and two birds, one above the other on the reverse. I don't know the meaning of this combination. In this slide, I grouped three seals with different animals, a dog, a griffin, and a lion, but all of them issued by macellari, that is butchers or meat sellers. And these three are not the only ones. There are more seals of macellari with animals. So the fact that there were several professionals from the same period dealing with meat and depicting carnivorous animals on their seals perhaps means that they were selecting these animals on purpose because they are related to hunting. But again, this is a hypothesis. Next, we see three slightly different representations of griffins. And in the following slide, a seal with a griffin on the obverse and another creature which cannot be identified on the reverse. Here we have one more of those anonymous seals depicting a griffin and a bird, while the next one, issued by Al-Savir, shows a griffin with a small bird clasped on his leg. At this moment, I would like to make a short excursus in order to explain a recent theory about the origins of the griffin, or griffon as it's called in English. It is a mythical, fantastic creature depicted in Asian and later Greek art for millennia. Traditionally, it is considered to have the head and the wings of an eagle and the legs and tail of a lion. According to a new theory put forward by Adrian Mayer, the image and legend of the griffin originated from Central Asia and Mongolia. In these areas, there is a lot of gold, and people were extracting and trading the precious metal since very old times. However, apart from gold, these areas also hide skeletons of a dinosaur species called Protoceratops. Mayer noticed that the earliest depictions of griffin heads are very similar to the skulls of this dinosaur, whose bones are from time to time uncovered in the Central Asian deserts, and thus these skulls and the bones are exposed to the humans who are looking for gold. The humans interpreted these skulls and bones as creatures who guard the gold and invented the myth that these creatures, whom they named griffins, are guarding the gold and treasures in general. Now, no matter whether this theory by Mayer is right or not, it certainly has some strong points. In the next image, we see again a griffin on the left, or at least part of it, the head is missing, and on the lower half, and the head of a large bird, which could be an ostrich or a crane. If it is indeed an ostrich, it is an exotic bird for Byzantine standards, comparable to the elephant that you see here. And now yet another exotic and mythical creature, a sphinx, which is very rarely depicted in Byzantine art in general. The sphinx supposedly had the head of a woman or a man, the body of a lion, and the wings of a bird. Just like the griffin, it is often associated with guarding treasures. After the exotic and mythical creatures, we go to the domesticated horses. The image of the horse, which was so common in Greek and Roman times, and even until late antiquity, it was not among the animals chosen by the Byzantines to decorate their seals. Here we see two seals from the 7th or perhaps 8th century. But later, during the revival of non-religious motifs in the second half of the 10th century, we see no horses on seals. In fact, they were only represented together with riders, military sense exclusively, if we don't count the seals issued by Western European noblemen who were campaigning in the East. And yet, in late antiquity, or in the early Byzantine period, horses are depicted alone, but not only alone, also with their riders, who were not saints, holy figures, and we know their names, sometimes even their career through literary sources. 3 of these figures are shown here, holding a wreath, a rolled parchment, and a spear, respectively. But there are many more on seals of that period. The images of these horse riders inevitably lead us to the images of the emperors and the question whether lesser people were allowed to put their figures or even their faces on seals, or that was a privilege exclusively reserved for the emperors. In fact, not only in Roman times and late antiquity, but also in later centuries, people were showing their faces on their seals. I shall present to you several of these seals, but not in strict chronological order. Let us begin with 2 of the seals issued by Michail Epiton Varvaron. On the first, there is a lion. On the second, a male portrait, which resembles those on Roman coins, and for this reason it is unclear whether it is the real portrait of Michail or an imitation of an ancient coin or another artifact. In the next slide, you see 4 seals, the 3 above and the one down left, issued by 3 very pious people who presented themselves kneeling in front of the Virgin or their patron saint, praying or thanking them. This scene with a small figure of the pious person kneeling or standing in front of the holy figure was very common in Byzantine and especially post-Byzantine painting, but it is rarely attested on Sills, and the very few specimens are all dated in the 11th and the 12th century. The same applies to Russian Sills, such as the one that you see here on the bottom right, issued by Knyaz Oleg Mikhail and following the Byzantine style. It's also from the 11th century. You see the small figures of the adorants here, also here. The next seal was issued by Stavrakios, yet another official επί των βαρβάρων. The figure on the obverse looks like it was inspired by Roman art, but it's not impossible that it is the actual portrait of Stavrakios himself. The same can be said about the portrait on the seal of Konstantinos, Komerkiarios of the West, dated in the same period. Notice the ribbons on the heads of both figures, here and here. It cannot be a coincidence, and instead of looking for parallels in ancient art, perhaps we should turn our focus on contemporary, that is 10th century images of state officials from other sources, such as wall paintings, mosaics, diptychs, and so on, to see whether such ribbons were used by officials in that period. The next group of seals comes from Cyprus, and they're all dated in the early period in the 5th and 6th century. Unfortunately, only the drawings are available. The first shows a seated or kneeling human figure holding an orb or ball here in one hand and a staff or stick in the other. The reverse shows a standing figure. The editor has not interpreted these figures, and my suggestion is that they could be images of acrobats or athletes. The second seal looks very similar, with a seated figure on one side and the figure of Hercules holding his club on the other. You see here the male figure and the club. Hercules is encountered on another seal as well, which I will present to you later. As for the third seal here, it shows a head very similar, with a very large eye socket, very similar to alien creatures depicted in modern cinema, and a block monogram, which is hard to interpret. These two seals are also from Cyprus, and they both show on the obverse a bust of a man with crosslets on each side. You can see the crosses here, here, here. The difference is that the first bust is en face and the person is wearing a garment with V-shaped neckline. On the reverse of the seal, there is a cross, and in the quarters, the letters epsilon, theta, alpha, and one more which cannot be seen. The second portrait on the right is in profile, facing right, and on the reverse, there is a monogram which could give the name Evstathios or Theognios, depending on the interpretation of the illegible letters. Despite the presence of crosslets, these two portraits do not represent holy figures, but secular people, perhaps the owners of the seals. And I'll close the presentation with images from classical tradition and mythology depicted on Byzantine seals. In a previous slide, we saw an early seal with a standing figure, which probably represents Hercules holding his club. The same personality is depicted on this 10th century seal issued by Konstantinos, Imperial Spatharios, and επί των βαρβάρων. Hercules is portrayed in bust, facing and holding the club, with some branches with leaves on each side. A similar portrait we see on the seal of Nikephoros, a colleague of Konstantinos from the same period. Another motif inspired by antiquity is the figure of Nike, Victoria. Although she was a deity and was widely used on coins and imperial seals as a symbol of political propaganda on some occasions, she's attested also on seals of private individuals. To show you only a few, here you see 3 seals issued by different people in various epochs, using Victoria on the obverse, despite the fact that they were not emperors. This happens because Victoria is no more a deity or a protector of emperors, but a symbol of power in general. Here on the first seal, on the left, you see a personification of Constantinople, according to the editor, Elena Stepanova. And on the second, a pygmy here, holding a spear and attacking a crane bird. The story of the pygmies and their fight with the cranes, the birds, comes directly from Greek mythology. And you see here how it is painted on an ancient crater from Italy. And the last image shows a seal from the 11th century, perhaps during the reign of Constantinos IX Monomachos, 1042-1055, or Constantinos X Doukas, 1058-1067. On the obverse, you see Saints Constantine and Helen, and on the reverse, Alexander the Great flying in the sky in a chariot carried by two griffins. This scene, which is described in some versions of the so-called Alexander's Romance, a very popular late antique and Byzantine book, resembles the scene of Prophet Elias, who is also represented to be carried by griffins. I could go on with more images, such as portraits of Romus and Romulus, or the three-headed figure on the seal of Estratios, Commerciarios of the West, and so on. But we have already seen a great variety of non-religious motifs on Byzantine seals. And now the theoretical aspect. In the early Byzantine period, the images of animals and birds could be perceived either as an influence from antiquity or as symbols adopted by Christianity in order to show the allegories, for example, the evil, the fight between the good and the evil, the eternity, and so on. Then, for a very long time, these images disappear completely from the iconography on seals, only to reappear in the 10th century. It is a fact, as you have also noticed from the images that I showed you, that after the period of late antiquity, the Byzantines were using extensively non-religious motifs in the 10th century, and especially in the second half. There are two conflicting theories about this trend put forward by Vaso Penna and Alicia Walker, respectively. Penna suggested that the revival of non-religious motifs, animals, human portraits, and so on in the 10th century was a trend directly influenced from Greek and Roman antiquity, as well as from the arrival of the great number of foreigners from various areas to the Byzantine capital, Constantinople. Walker, on the other hand, attributed all these motifs to the Islamic influence through the border zones and also the cosmopolitan air in the capital, which had adopted the artistic influence of Islam. My personal approach is that all these images are rather related to the Greek and Roman past than the Islamic art. The Griffin, for example, was very often represented on seals of Byzantine officials serving at the eastern border area of Chaldea. However, instead of an Islamic influence, I would rather look at the long-lasting influences from Central Asia, from where the Griffin myth originated, that were reaching the Byzantines in Chaldea through traveling merchants from Asia. The same happened in antiquity. Besides, this area, with the city of Trabzon being the main center, was one of the terminals of the great trade routes from Central Asia to the West since antiquity, and definitely long before Islam. Let us not forget that griffins and other exotic figures appear also on seals of Commerciarii in Chaldea and other places of the empire, that is, the officials who were in contact with the merchants. As for the other animals and birds, it's very likely that they were copied from Greek and Roman art. In 10th century Byzantium, there was a turn to classical studies. Scholars were studying the ancient Greek and Roman literature and art, and it is only natural that within this so-called Byzantine humanism, as Paul Lemerle named it, the ancient motifs passed to the seals as well. Another aspect of the 10th century trend that was suggested by Penna is about the apotropaic character of these symbols or their prophetic power. The scholar found many similarities and common points in the spread of such symbols on seals and the spread of prophetic texts mentioning these symbols in that same period. For example, according to such texts, popular in the 10th century, if you see in your dreams an eagle or a peacock, you will get riches and power. However, no matter how convincing each of these theories is, there are still some unsolved mysteries and some unanswered questions. For example, why most of the state officials, epiton varvaron, were using such motifs? It is possible, as Nicholas Economidis and later Vaso Penna suggested, that they were very familiar with them, with these symbols, and they liked them because themselves, these officials, they were of foreign origin, and these symbols were part of their cultures. But before we support this theory, we must prove that these people were indeed foreigners, a task which is, of course, if not impossible, at least very difficult for any scholar to achieve, for we lack the necessary evidence, either from art or from literary sources. And to conclude, when we hear about Byzantine art, we immediately and automatically think of Christianity, crosses and holy figures. But Byzantine art had many faces, one of which was not related to religious beliefs, and numerous motifs were presented on sills. I hope that the images that you saw today revealed this other face of Byzantine art, and will encourage you to look further and deeper into this fascinating topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Pantelis. This was a very different, very lively and also presentation. And at least for me personally speaking, it was very, very different from what I would have thought. So that was really very thought-provoking. Thank you very much. Now I would like to ask the audience if they have any questions, and let me just pause the stop the recording.